You've probably heard people say that BMW stands for broke my water pump or barely moving wreck. But some people also say that it stands for beast the monstrous wonder or brings me women. So which one is it really? Since I've owned a couple of BMWs and I've been a member of several European car clubs, I have some insights to share. The myth of BMW's reliability issues is oftentimes exaggerated, but there's also a bit of truth to it in some cases. On this 2017 chart, BMW surprisingly ranks higher than Honda. Based on experience, I know that I've had fewer issues on my 99 5 Series than on my 2006 Civic. While the reliability of various car brands is debatable, it is practically a given fact that when BMWs break, the cost of repairs, while not as expensive as most people think, are still more expensive than your average Japanese car. Anyway, in this video, I'll try to separate fact from fiction. I'll be talking about some common issues of several BMW models. Since I'm mostly familiar with the E39, the E46, and the E36, I'll mostly be sharing first-hand knowledge about these models, but I'll also talk about newer models like the E90, the E60, based on experiences of friends and acquaintances. This is the BMW M52 engine. If you have a mid-90s to early 2000s BMW that isn't a V8, and hopefully not a 4-cylinder, you probably have one of these in your car. It came in different displacements, from the 2-liter variant, which produced 150 brake horsepower, to the 3-liter variant, which produced 241 brake horsepower. The S52 engine, which powered the E36 M3, is actually based on the M52 with some modifications. Most enthusiasts would agree that mechanically, the M52 is practically bulletproof. Its weakness is in the parts surrounding the engine, namely the cooling system. Most people say that the cooling system is one of the weakest points in any BMW. It is especially true for this generation. BMW's cooling systems have a lot of plastic parts, which can get brittle with age and constant heat exposure. This thermostat housing, for example, is one of the weak points in the system. The part is not that expensive to replace though. It only cost me about $30. The damage that will happen if any part of your cooling system fails will most likely cost a lot more. So if you buy a car and you don't know the history, just replace the part for your peace of mind. Oil leak should be pretty common for BMWs of this generation. As long as it's not dripping, I don't think that it should be a major cause for concern, but you should be aware of it nonetheless. One of the most common sources of oil leaks is the oil filter housing, which is pretty difficult to see without a bit of disassembly. I had mine replaced already. It cost me just $13 for the gasket and a bit more for the labor. Other common sources of oil leaks are the oil pan and the valve cover. But like I said, unless it's dripping and unless you have to constantly top up your oil, a bit of wetness is to be expected on older engines. One of the pluses of this engine is that it's pretty easy to maintain. The oil filter housing is easily accessible, and because it's an i6, all the spark plugs are on one side of the engine and therefore easy to access. The E39 and the E46 share a few common parts, and the technology in both cars is about similar. One issue that is pretty common for the E46 is the rear subframe. I know at least 2 cars where the subframe completely sheared off the unibody. You know that you have this issue when you hear a loud thunk every time you shift. This is a design issue, as the part of the unibody chassis where the subframe attaches to is not as strong as it should be. What people usually do is they buy reinforcement kits to strengthen the area. The control arm bushings also tend to fail early. And you can't just replace the bushings, you'll have to replace the entire control arm. You'll probably find plenty of suspension parts in the used market though. I'd say that the E46 is slightly easier to service. Certain parts are more difficult to access on the E39. One of the more frustrating repair jobs that I had on my E39 was when my blower fan failed. On the E46, it's a simple job. You access the blower fan through the firewall underneath the hood. It's a 5-minute job. On the E39, the entire dashboard had to be removed, which is a very labor-intensive and time-consuming job. It took a couple of days. Also, to remove the oil pan gasket on the E39, we have to remove the subframe of the front suspension as well as most of the steering. Another common issue on both the E39 and the E46 is the ABS light. Usually this is caused by one of the wheel speed sensors failing. The sensors themselves are not that expensive though, about $30 to $50 each. 90s to mid-2000s BMWs have been out for a while, so sourcing parts for them is not so difficult. You can buy used parts, aftermarket parts, or original OEM parts. The newer the car, the more difficult it usually is to find used parts for it. The cost of the parts, of course, would vary depending on where you are. Naturally, V8s and higher performance models are going to be more expensive to maintain. The V8 540i and the M5 will cost more to maintain and repair simply because they're more complex machines. 2 extra cylinders and 1 extra head. The 4 cylinders are going to be cheaper to maintain, but I personally think that it kind of defeats the purpose of having a BMW. I think the 6 cylinders offer a good compromise between power, reliability, and running costs. If you go up to the newer models, mid-2000s until the mid-2010s, like the E60, the E90, the cost of repairs and maintenance go up quite a bit. Parts are usually more expensive. They rely more on electronics, and generally they're not designed to be serviced as easily. Common issues on the E90 are the Mechatronic transmission and the steering sensor. I know someone in my local BMW group who had his E90's Mechatronic transmission and steering column replaced, with the car having less than 2,000 kilometers on the odo. He still had warranty for his car, but they're very expensive repairs if you get the car without warranty. Other common issues on the E90 are the water pumps, the steering angle sensor. Turbocharged models tend to be less reliable, with turbos reportedly going out between 65,000 to 100,000 miles. You've probably heard about the Bmw Fire Hazard recall. This generation of cars is affected by that recall. The likelihood of it happening is very small. There's not a single report of it happening in my country, but if it does happen, needless to say it is catastrophic. One cause of the issue is the blower motor wiring shorting out. Another possible cause is the heated oil separator. Anyway, if you're affected by this issue, BMW should fix it for free. On the E60 M5, rod bearing failure is a very common problem, so much so that it's included in most owners' preventive maintenance. So are BMWs reliable? You'll get different answers to that question depending on who you ask. You'll hear stories of people who've never had problems with their BMWs, even after several years of ownership. And people who have had major issues with their cars, even with less than 2,000 kilometers on the odo. There are good and bad stories for every model. Actually, you'll find that that's the same case even with some Japanese cars. The 8th Gen Civic, for example, were notorious for having power steering issues. I've had 6 8th Gen Civics, and 4 of them have had their power steering pumps replaced. Most of the time, reliability boils down to good maintenance. But other times, it also just boils down to luck.